So, I'm back. What I really wanted to discuss, and it's a bit further on from the discussion we had about the World War I rifles, is to actually go into just have a look a bit more what they were like to fight with in the trenches, especially because, I don't know if you get an entire rifle in, SMLE here, it's a fairly long, heavy rifle. And as we all know, the trenches was confined, muddy, hand-to-hand fighting, close quarters. Don't forget, these rifles were designed, well, before the Boer War, but that's really where sort of the Enfield, and even before it, the Martini Henry, sort of the Zulu Wars in Africa, that's where the conception for the cartridges and the power and the long range and musketry, obviously inherent to the British Army, came from, because we were, battles were being engaged at hundreds of metres, so you needed a long rifle that was accurate up to those ranges, which every sort of Western army subscribed to. Germans with their G98, which was even longer, the French with their less than successful rifles, and really every major army up until sort of the introduction of the 5.56 in the late 50s, early 60s, where the sort of realisation that most contacts were under 300 metres, and just deviating slightly from topic, I read somewhere just the other day that a soldier with an automatic weapon is more likely to fire it than they are in a single shot or a slower to reload weapon, such as a bolt action. So if you've got a soldier with a Thompson or a Sten gun or MP40 or MP38, they're more likely to blast away than people, firing one shot at a time. And that's probably, in my opinion, somebody that feels like they can do something more. You're putting a whole load of lead down, you feel like you're keeping people's heads under cover. There's one shot, you make shot, you reload, and quite considerable in terms of firepower. Time has elapsed before the next shot is followed up, and most shots are probably unaimed as well. Very, very few shots will have been aimed because most targets were moving. So the average rifleman, isn't going to be able to hit a running target at filming. So yeah, I was just talking about the sort of average infantryman being able to hit a moving man-sized target. It's not an easy thing to do, as any of you have shot at a man-sized target. In the UK we call them figure 11, it's what the military use. It's not a big target to hit. Anyway, I was going slightly off target. What I really want to talk about is fighting with the SMLE in the trenches, or in some of the cases you might find the troops didn't. We'll get onto it, but they sort of got to the stage where they decided not to use them. But technically, your soldier, he had his SMLE, which you're familiar with. This is mine, 1917 I think this one is. So it's a Mark 3 star. And this is what else they're issued with. The pattern 1907 bayonet. As you can see, it's very long. I think, off the top of my head, it's 32, it's not 32 inches, that's rubbish. 17 inches, I think. I cannot remember off the top of my head, it's just gone there. So anyway, this mounts very simply onto the rifle, just for this. I've missed there. There's a guide rail, and it's that front boss there that attaches quite firmly. It's not going to come off. But as you can see, this is now an extremely long arm, and the SMLE, unlike, was the first sort of rifle to be a general issue weapon. There was no carbines, there was no long rifles, it was the standard rifle, whereas the Germans, they had the long rifle for your sort of average troops, the stormtroopers, and say support troops, they had the carbine version. So as we've sort of discussed, the trenches aren't the best places for having a long bayoneted weapon. You get in there, they're not that wide, they're probably 3.5, 4 foot at the bottom where most men stood, getting a bit wider towards the top. You obviously got the fire step in there, and another obstacle. And also the trenches, they're not in a straight line, they were zigzagged to basically stop aircraft strafing them, or if an artillery shell burst, to stop fragments going all the way down the trench for hundreds of yards, and to stop an enemy soldier jumping in and just being able to shoot his way down. They were designed to basically make it as hard as possible to take, so these barricades stopped shrapnel, bullets and all sorts going down. So it made it really quite unwieldy. Another issue is, I don't know if you can hear it, but it rattles quite a lot. So if you were trying to attack a trench at night, you would, if you're not careful, people might hear you coming. The problem with these long bayonets, I mentioned it before, is, although they're quite thick metal, as you can see there, they're flexible. So you stick it in somebody, or you get it caught on something hard enough, it's likely you can snap it, and in many cases where they were snapped. I think the Indians actually adopted a slightly shorter bayonet. I don't know if they did it in the First World War, but I think in the Second World War they did have a shorter one, although the 1907 was still widely used, definitely by Commonwealth troops, still equipped with the SMLE. So that caused problems. So often on trench raid, the SMLE wasn't the best thing to take with you. The rate of fire was too slow. You had to be relatively accurate, which for a snapshot from someone 15-20 yards away isn't always that easy. The adrenaline pumping. So what I found, or you'll find, a lot of soldiers started going into doing trench raids with things just like bayonets. So we'll just talk about how unwieldy it was to go in with your Enfield with your bayonet on and rocking out the full-length piece of kit. So what a lot of soldiers started to do was take the bayonet off and start using it effectively as its own dagger. Now it's called a sword bayonet. It's long, it's fairly heavy, it's not particularly a sharp blade, it's really designed for thrusting, for sort of the whole stabbing motion. And really, it didn't do the job, but it was probably better than trying to use it on the end of a rifle when you're jumping into a trench. So what a lot of people did, they started using knives. Now this is just what I call a normal hunting knife. It's nothing historical, it's just a normal blade. Now this, the sort of size people started using. It's handy, get right in there, it's not constricting. You've really probably got the best of both worlds. You've got blade, it's sharp, get in, do what you need to do, and you're not sort of clanging around with something. So other options really were, alright, you go with your rifle, you don't have your bayonet on, you have got bloody good weapon, but the firepower it can deliver is not great. So early in the war, some officers started using their shotguns, if they were sort of from a shooting background in England. But again, they might have replaced bird shot with a heavier sort of buckshot, but you've only got two barrels, you're not delivering huge amounts of firepower. They also had the officers themselves, and maybe the odd other person had a revolver. These had to be privately purchased by the officer, and they were as long as they were in 4.55 calibre, you had to buy it yourself and supply it. Again, yes, you're providing a lot of whack with a revolver, but the problem is, again, you've only got 6 shots. And I think really what it boils down to, by the time the First World War was kicking off, the way war was now being fought, weaponry hadn't really caught up. I mean, the bolt-action rifle, yes, it's great when you're sort of out in a plane and you've got acres and acres of space you can see and shoot at people, but this was up close and sort of almost medieval style warfare. Which then brings me on to my next point. People started using things which hadn't been seen for hundreds of years, so clubs, maces, sort of knuckle dusters with knives in them, all these sort of horrible weapons we associate with sort of Dark Ages knights and castles and things like that started making a reappearance, because the knights and the sort of soldiers in those times used them because they were efficient at killing people at close range. An interesting adaptation of sort of a fairly standard soldier's tool, which soldiers still carry today, was the entrenching tool. This is short, probably about so long, fairly heavy. You grind an edge onto that blade and you've got, as All Quiet on the Western Front, the book says, a very good weapon for cleaving people. The book mentions you were able to cleave people straight through into their chest. A devastating blow, you get a lot of energy out of that. So these really basic weapons in a modern war were starting to be used. Initially, things like grenades weren't particularly issued in large quantities, or if even, I think, developed particularly by the British. You found a lot of people using jam jars and tins filled with gunpowder and nails and all sorts, and having a crude fuse and using those as their makeshift grenades until a Mills bomb arrived. Now, a Mills bomb could be carried, it was sort of in like a sack, almost a bit like a pouch, across the abdomen, up round here, and used to carry quite a number of bombs in it. The whole idea was you can chuck them into trenches, chuck them into dugouts, and kill the people where they lay, or flush them out to either be shot or captured, which was obviously half the point of trench raids, was to capture people to make sure that they could get intelligence on who they were standing opposite and maybe what was going to happen, whether it was going to be a trench raid themselves or a full-on assault. So this sort of fighting obviously went on. Some units were more aggressive than others. Some had a live and let live policy, or an official policy. So it was kind of along the lines of, we're not going to bother the Germans, they're not going to bother us. But that could very change by the time that unit was replaced in the line, which was fairly regularly, probably every 2 weeks or so. A new unit was maybe more aggressive leader would come in, and basically the war would kick off again for whoever was opposite them. It can't have been an easy thing. You had to get out the trench through your own wire. There's usually paths cutting your own wire or routes out, to then make your way through the enemy wire and get into their trench, get out and do the whole journey. Now, sometimes the trenches were 40 metres apart, other times they were sort of a couple of 100 metres apart. So you had this huge expanse of land at times to pass, trying not to make noise, and if a star shell went up, you had to freeze, make sure you weren't going to be spotted. And the same coming back, because you had to get whoever you had pinched from that trench back alive. Now, I can't imagine it was a particularly easy thing to do or a nice thing to do, especially as we've said, don't really think the weapons have caught up with the requirements of the soldiers. It wasn't until later in the war things like the Thompson were even conceived. It never made the war. The American BAR was used limited, and that was still too big a heavy weapon for the trench warfare. And the really only sort of success was sort of the German submachine gun that they used right towards the end of the stormtroopers. But again, that was issued in such limited quantity that it was never really able to make a real dent on the battlefield. So I hope you found this useful, entertaining. Any comments, please put them in the comment box below. I'll do my best to answer them. Sorry if I made any mistakes, feel free to correct me.